Hi, I'm Matt, and in this episode you're going to learn about the wiring for the Omnibus F4V2 flight control board. Now this flight control board is the one with the current sensor, and it's also the one which I would class as an advanced setup. So with that in mind, for this episode I'm going to assume as little as I can. So this episode is going to be longer than what you may find elsewhere on YouTube. But I wanted to cover all the basics with you so that you know how to wire up your F4 flight control board, the one which has got the current sensor on there, and so that you're able to use it on your model airplane and you know what's going on in short. So with that said, let's jump in straight at the deep end. Now, I've got some screenshots up here, and I tell you what, let me just start with the obvious one. Let's take a look at the board. Now, the reason why I'm not showing you the board, because me trying to show you that little flashing board on a web camera is not going to really work out. So instead, I've got some photographs of the board itself, and we'll be looking at the pinouts. Now, with that said, let's start with the basics. Which way's up? This is the top of the board. And you know it's the top of the board because it's the top of the board because it's got an arrow pointing to the right on the top of the board. Now, that arrow is actually the front of the board. So these connectors and that little white plug, okay, that is the front of the board, and that's the front of the board which you want to point towards the front of the model. Okay, nice and straightforward so far. Happy days. Now, this board is slightly different compared to the V1 board, and the reason why it's slightly different is because on the back of the board we have two soldering pads, and also there's a third pad underneath for ground as well. And then crucially, we've got this resistor on the board itself. Now, I need to make you aware of this one because I just did my research, and apparently these little boards are rated up to 200 amps. Well, that resistor, you can run these boards up to 200 amps. However, I might have a H&D in electrical and electronic communication and engineering, and that my history and my background is screaming out at me to give you some pre-warning, okay? Personally, I would strongly suggest that you do not run anything more than 40 amps continuously through this board. And the reason being is that yes, it might be rated up to 200 amps, but 200 amps through that tiny little board is just bonkers. Don't do it, in short. Keep to, so if you're using a motor with your models, is that make sure that you're running nothing more than 40 amps continuously through this board itself. Now, obviously, if you're flying something like a mini Talon, for example, you're only ever going to be cruising around on 9 amps or something like that, maybe a few more amps if you don't want to return to home or fighting with wind. Okay, most flying wings, you're not going to be pulling more than 40 amps through it anyway. Okay, the Skywalker Falcon, which you may have seen in a previous episode, again, that thing was only pulling about 8 amps on full knacker, you know. So, well, actually 24 amps on full knacker, let me get that correct, because it was only cruising around on a couple of amps with that motor and prop propeller combination. So anyway, just needed to make that important point. They may be rated for 200 amps, but I strongly suggest you do not run 200 amps through that board, because that's a lot of current, and it's your model, you know. If it's my model, no more than 40 amps. Point made. Anyway, moving on. The good news about this board is that while you do need 3 extra power connections for this board, all in all, it's pretty cool because you do get to see the amount of current which is being used by your model in the sky, and you also get the battery voltage much more easily to display on your screen as well. So with that said, moving on, what I've been and got, and let me just go and get this up on your screen for you. So that's the top view, that's a photograph, and what I've got here is the same picture but as a pinout diagram. And what we're going to do, we're going to have a wander around this so that you know where you need to be jabbing your pins. And of course, I'll show you how to do that in a later episode as well, in real life too. So the best place for us to start is with the S-bus input. Or in fact, no, actually the best place for us to start is just making a quick point on where positive and negative is, okay, as far as your servos and receiver is concerned. This outside rail there is ground, and the middle row, when I go and get red, there we go, is the 5 volts. And then this inner set, which I'm going to do in green for you, which there's a nice green. There we go. That row there is our signal inputs. Okay, so when you put your connectors in, ground is on the outside and the signal wire, which is either white or a yellow wire, goes towards the middle of the board. Right, moving on nice and quickly. The first connector down from the top, so this one here, and you'll see it's written as S-bus. That's where you would take your S-bus output or PPM output from your receiver and then plug it into your board. Now for this series, I am going to be using an X8R receiver. So we take the S-bus out from that receiver and then plug it in here, and we just make sure that our signal pin is going on to the inner part of the board, and happy days. That's why you needed that male-to-male connector. And then below there, we've got our PWM outputs, and we've also got two more down there. But which ones do you connect your ESC to, and which ones do you connect your elevons to, or your elevator and your rudder to if you're flying a normal fixed wing model? That's a great question. And the thing is, there's no secrets to this. There's no voodoo or black magic. Is that, let me just go and choose the right one on here, is that you'll notice that I've got iNav here running in the background, and you'll see that this board has been set up for a flying wing. And iNav tells you which connectors go where. So 1 and 2 are for your motors. Okay, I'm saying motors is like a bit of a question mark on, is because typically most flying wings only have one motor. So you would put that in PWM1. So that's the second set of pins down from the top. Now, that is where you would plug your ESC wire in. Now, it's really important to note here is that if you're using an ESC which has a built-in back, so in other words, it comes out with a red wire down the middle, you need to disconnect that wire. So you unpin that wire, fold it round, and then sellotape it up out the way. And the reason why you're going to be doing that is because the board is already supplying 5 volts. If you've got another 5 volts being pumped in from another source, aka your back, they're going to fight with each other, and that's not the best scenario for you to be in. So make sure if you're using a back if you're using an ESC which has a back built in, you unplug that wire and then fold it backwards and tape it up securely out of the way, especially so it can't short with anything else on elsewhere around on the board. All good so far? So that was 1 and 2. So if you have 2 motors on a flying wing, that'd be classed as happy days. You would put both ESCs in there. Now, obviously, most people only have 1 motor on a flying wing, so you'd put that into PWM1. Then we need to connect our left aileron or elevon to PWM output 3 and our right elevon to PWM output number 4. So that would be 3 there. That would go to our left elevon, and PWM output 4 to our right elevon. Really simple so far, pretty straightforward. Now you may be wondering, Matt, what about a normal airplane which has got an elevator and rudder? Good question. So let's go and grab iNav, and I'm going to drop that down and choose aeroplane. Different picture this time, but similar numbers. Okay, so we've got motors 1 and 2, just like before. So we'll assume it's just a normal airplane. We've got a motor in there, so I've put that on the wrong one. That was the RS bus. We would put our motor onto PWM1. Also then looking at the picture, so number 3 is our elevator. So we would connect our elevator to PWM output number 3. Where is number 4? So number 4 is our left aileron, and 5 is our right aileron. So there's PWM 4 and there is PWM 5. Now obviously if you are going to be using iNav with a normal fixed wing model, and remember this series is for flying wings, is that you're going to supply 5 volts for that servo. Maybe you want to hijack from the spare 5 volt pin. Let me just undo that a second. The spare 5 volt pin which you've got on this board for PWM2, which wasn't being used, okay, because maybe you were only just running 1 motor. And the last one which we had was 6, which is our rudder. So we want to connect our rudder servo to that pin there, which is PWM6 out. All good so far? Making sense? Going slow enough for you? I hope so. Right, let's get that back to flying wing and move that out of the way. The next section which I'm going to cover with you is the on-screen display and setting up FPV. Now, I am there is one assumption which I'm going to make for this series, which is that you've set up FPV before. And as we all know, FPV wiring is super simple. We have ground, so the black wire. We have positive, which is our power supply. And then we have a yellow wire. And normally what we do, we take our FPV camera, we take the yellow wire and we connect it to our video transmitter on the yellow wire. And then we take the video and it goes through there, through the video transmitter, and then we pick it up on our goggles. Nice and simple, isn't it? Now, the way these flight controllers work by adding an on-screen display is that we need to take the video signal from our FPV camera and we put it into video in, which is, drew that a bit wrong then, didn't I? Video in, which is that pin just there. So we take our yellow wire from our FPV camera and we put it into the board. Then iNav will add the on-screen display in front of that for you. So we then take our video out and we take that out to our video transmitter. That's how we get the on-screen display. The flight controller board puts the on-screen display, the layer, because we take the video signal in, goes in through the board, jumps out the other side and goes onto our video transmitter. And that's the other two pins which we need to be aware of. Now, there's a very important note here as far as FPV goes with these flight control boards, is that you must have a common ground. So the grounds which you're using on your FPV camera and on your video transmitter, at some point in time, those do need to reach the ground pin on this flight control board. So it could be the ground pins there, which are the most obvious ones. It could be a spare ground pin down there or there, because those two are also ground pins. Or it could be on the underside of your board, which we'll get to in a few moments, which is the main ground, or it could be back on your battery pack or on the other end by your ESC. Okay, so a big note there, when it comes to FPV, you may be using something like a low pass filter. Even if you are using a low pass filter, you still need a common ground. So make sure there's a ground wire which comes to a ground point somewhere on your model there. Right, moving on. The other section, well, there's three more sections for us to cover. Okay, so we're making really good progress so far. On our board, so let me just see if I can move this out of the way, is that there's our board. On the right hand side, you'll see that you've got this white little JST connector on the right hand side. So that was the additional wire which I missed out in a previous episode. Apologies for that. But we need that little wire to plug in the side. And the reason why we need that wire to plug in the side is that's where we are going to connect up our GPS unit. Now, the wiring for this is actually really straightforward. And again, I'm giggling to myself because it really is straightforward. On the right-hand side, we have ground and 5 volts. Those two are super straightforward. So they're in the middle of the connector, okay? We need to connect those to the black and the red wires on our GPS. All good so far? Two of the wires which come out of our GPS, and again, I'll show you the wiring for the GPS in a separate episode, but for now you'll have to take my word for it. The white wire and the yellow wire which comes out of your GPS, they are the TX and the RX wires, and we need to take the TX from our GPS and connect it to our RX pin on this plug. Okay, and of course we then take the RX pin from our GPS and we connect it to the TX, and I think I got that the right way around. Basically the TX and the RX pins wires need to be swapped around, so RX goes to TX and TX goes to RX. I hope that makes sense. Basically they need to be crossed. Okay, so that's those top two there, RX6 and TX6. Now also, if you've been and chosen this board as well, you might as well go on and carry on and wire up the SCL and SDA wires. And again, I'll show you how to wire those up in a later episode, but just be aware there's a little white plug which you need to solder on your GPS to on the side, and that will have power for the GPS. It's got 2 wires for the GPS signal itself, and the SCL and SDA at the bottom, those wires do the magnometer, so the compass in that unit as well. That's why I suggested that black the Neo MAN compass from Banggood, because I've used those myself before, and they also have a compass on the bottom side of those units too. Right, moving on. 2 sections to go. The next section is potentially the one bit which you may find confusing, okay? But I'd like to assure you it's really straightforward. Now, we need to get power onto this board, and the irony is it's very, very simple to power this board up. It just looks a bit weird. Okay, once you get your head around it, you go, oh, actually, Matt, that's really simple. So I need to choose the colors on here, and I've got a photograph of an install in the C1 Chaser, which I'll show you in a moment. But first, let's just cover the basics. The idea of a current sensor is that we take our positive line from our battery, we run it through a little resistor, and by the way, that's the resistor, okay? And then the board is able to then measure how much current is actually being used by your motor, or maybe your other parts in your model, such as servos, for example, or your FPV equipment, so that you get an idea on how much current or how many milliampere hours you've been used from your battery, and you then know, well, oh, actually, I've not used a lot. I can fly forever now, or oh, I've actually used quite a lot. I'm getting very, very close to near to the capacity. I need to land very quickly. Anyway, with that said, I'm just going to draw a really little bad battery. Okay, so there is a battery. Okay, there is plus and there is minus. And I did say I was going to draw a bad battery, and I think you're going to agree. So we need to take our positive wire, okay, and obviously you'd have a Dean's or an XT60 connector in the way of this one. Okay, we're going to take our positive wire and we need to go to the BAT plus pad. Okay, now I will show you how to solder up these boards in a later episode, but for now we're just covering the theory. We'll take our battery positive wire and then put it onto the BAT plus, and then where it says Moto VCC, we then take solder wire on there, and then that's where we take it on to the rest of your install. Now, that's the rest of your install where you need full battery voltage. So three places where that's most likely going to happen. Your ESC is the obvious one. The second one is your video transmitter, and most likely also your FPV camera too. So you need to take that positive wire and then take it onto your normally your ESC, most likely also your video transmitter, and also your FPV camera too. Now you may be wondering, well, Matt, we've got a minus. What do we do with the ground pin? Okay, well actually that's hiding on the underside of the board. Now I need to go and find it a moment. I think I've got it up here on the screen somewhere. Right, that is the bottom side of the board. And on the underside of the board, and you can see now where there was no hope in Blue Monkeys that I was going to be able to show you on the web camera about this tiny little board. Anyway, you're going to have to take my word for it. On the bottom of the board, we have, and I need to choose an apt colour, which is black. On the bottom of the board, there is a pad, which is labelled GND, which is ground. And that's where you attach your negative wire. All good so far? On the top of the board, let me move that one out of the way. There we go. Make that bigger. We take our positive, we put it on, solder onto the BAT plus, and then we take the output, where it says Moto, and we then take that on to our ESC and most likely our FPV kit as well. And then on the bottom of the board, we need to solder up our ground from our battery. So where we've got the negative terminal here, and we solder that onto the bottom of the board. Now, what does that look like in real life? That's a very good question. Give me a moment. I'm going to get a photo up on your screen for you. Right. On first glance, this wiring looks scary, okay? But in reality, it's really straightforward. So I just need to identify a couple of things for you. So on the left-hand side here is our battery connector. In fact, I'm going to go and get this image into Photoshop for you so that I can just draw on top of it. Give me a moment. I'm just going to... Right, there we go. So I've got it open in Photoshop, and this makes it a little bit easier for us because I can zoom in and I can draw on top of this picture. Right, let's go and we'll start with the live line. So on the left-hand side over here, this is where we've got the battery plug. That's where we plug our battery in. Now you'll notice that we've got two ground wires coming out the bottom. Ignore that for now. It will make more sense in just a moment. But let's draw this red line all the way along here, and you'll see that that wire goes round to our BAT plus. Okay, so that's where it's being soldered in on the board. I'm just going to zoom in a bit so it makes a little bit more sense for you. Let me just undo that. So there's our positive coming from our battery, comes around and gets soldered onto our board there. Then we have another red wire which comes out of this board, and that, believe it or not, goes out there and it comes round and comes out to this socket on the right hand side. And that socket, I've just unplugged to show you, is that is the connector which I then plug in to the ESC. So just down here is the battery connector for the ESC. So our positive, I'm going to quickly draw this again, our positive comes from our battery, goes along that wire there, goes into the BAT plus pin, it then comes out of our flight control board, goes round and up into this plug over here on the right hand side, which is normally plugged in to the XT60 connector down there, because we've got an ESC hiding up underneath there. Okay, all good so far? Happy days? Right, ground. Now I'm going to choose green for this so it stands out a little bit better on your screen for you. So let's choose green. Now when it comes to ground, is that you'll notice we've got two wires there, and the reason why I've done that is purely for simplicity and also ease as well. Trying to solder two big fat wires on the bottom of a tiny board, it's not going to work out very well. So I went the simpler route, and the simpler route was much simpler. I soldered on two wires to the battery connector. That's why we've got two black wires over here on the left hand side. So the first one comes round and then gets soldered up onto the ground pad underneath the board. The other ground wire comes out, and then you have to take my word for it because it goes around underneath there and then comes up here to our ESC connector. And of course, as we learned just a moment ago, that connector is normally joined up with the ESC connector, and that's how we get ground on our flight control board and for our ESC. Now, I sincerely hope that makes sense. Now, of course, you would probably also want to go and tap off 5 volt. And of course, you would probably then want to go on and maybe tap up ground from either here, okay, or as I've done, and you can only just see it in that photo. Let me zoom right in, okay. What you can just about see here is that there's a ground wire coming out of there, and then there's a positive wire going out there, okay. And that's where I've been and tapped the plus and minus full battery voltage, so that I can then go on and power the FPV camera, which is sat on the front of the nose, and the video transmitter, which is out on our left. Okay, so that's how I've been and physically wired up the device. The last thing which I'm going to cover with you, and this is like the most awkward part, I really mean this, it's an absolute nightmare. If you don't have good soldering skills, I would frankly suggest that you don't do it. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about RSSI, okay? The one negative thing which I can say about this board is that I'm going to have to zoom right in. And when you see the board for real life and you go, yeah, Matt, I'm going to agree with you, that's really difficult to solder, is that right on the bottom of this board, and by the way, you can tell it's the bottom of the board because you've got the little SD card slot on the bottom, is that I'm going to zoom right in, and that there, okay, is the RSSI pin. Okay, so if you want RSSI to show up on your on-screen display, you've got to solder on what I suggest pre-soldering that tab, okay, and then you'll need to put your own little wire, which then you can grab it from your receiver, and then that's the pin which you solder your RSSI in. So you probably have another wire coming in, okay, and that's where you solder your RSSI wire to. That's the only bad thing which I can say about this board, is that is a little bit awkward. So with that said, let's go and quickly recap what we've been and covered here and what we've been and learned about this board. In fact, I'll tell you what, let me move that one away the way. I'm not going to do that one. I'm not going to talk about that one. No, that is the one which I want. Apologies. There we go. Let's quickly recap what we've been and learned. The front of the board is this side of the board. We know it's the front of the board because there's an arrow on top of the board itself. We put our S-bus or PPPM inputs on the first set of pins. We put our ESC onto the second one, which is PWM1. If you're using a flying wing, as I'm going to be covering in this series, your left servo goes to this set of pins, which is PWM3. Always got that wrong name, which is PWM3, and our right elevon servo goes to PWM4. If you're using a traditional flight fixed wing model, then those pinouts were different. We covered those earlier. When it comes to video, we put our video into this top pin, and we take our video out. So that, let me get that correct. The FPV signal So that the yellow wire from our FPV camera comes in and goes to that pin there, and then we take that yellow wire back out of that pin there, and we take that onto our video transmitter. When it comes to wiring the board itself, we put our mains, well, the main positive from our battery onto bat plus, and then we take the other from the opposite side of the resistor, we take that out, and then we take that onto our ESC, just like we saw with the setup in the C1 Chaser. And then also that's where you can grab the main battery pack voltage for, say, your FPV camera, and also your video transmitter too. Also on the bottom of the board there is the ground pad, and as we saw with the C1 Chaser, just for ease, what I did with my install, and to be honest, I suggest you do that for your install. You take one red wire, comes round onto the board, then you take that red wire back out of the board and take it onto say an XT60 connector for your ESC. And then for the ground, to make things really easy, because soldering onto a tiny little board like that, and there's the ground pin, and you're only just going to be able to tap my finger on it, it's just down there, is trying to put 2 or more wires on the bottom of there is crazy. So make your life a lot easier. What I did with mine, I soldered up 2 black cables from ground, or the black. So to make your life easier, you take solder on 2 wires to your battery connector. So you take one round to the bottom of the flight controller board, so that makes it easier to solder up, and then the other black wire you run round, and then you put that onto the bottom of the connector, which you then connect to your ESC wire. And there was one other pin which we saw, which was on the bottom of the board, and that is for the RSSI. And to be honest, if you can solder onto that little RSSI pad, the rest of this stuff is really straightforward. So for myself, Matt, I sincerely hope that this episode's been and helped you. I know that this was a longer episode to maybe what perhaps you're used to on YouTube, but I wanted to cover all the basics with you. I know that for many of you, using a flight control board like this one or this one, this may be the first time you've used a board like this, and you have no prior experience of sticking connectors into these, and you may have not even know which one the PWM ones were, or even knew that they existed on Banggood in the photos. Okay, I want to make, and it's my goal for this series to make this as straightforward as possible. These boards are super cheap, but they do require a little bit of prior knowledge, which you have now got the vast majority of it. Okay, all of it. That's basically what you've got, all of it. The only little piece of the puzzle which you've got is soldering up the wires for the GPS sensor, which I'll cover in a later tutorial for you. Okay, that is it. That's it. Once you know where to jam the servo connectors on, and that you need to with this board specifically for your ESC wire, if it's got a beck, we need to fold the positive wire out of the way. That's it. Okay, it's really straightforward. So with that said, from myself, Matt, I sincerely hope that you found this episode useful, and I'll see you in the next part of this series on iNav. From myself, Matt, cheerios!